In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Hello, Charles. I have 5 questions for you today. First, I know that you admire the works of Tolkien and H.P. Lovecraft, and I honestly think that you're the greatest Catholic writer and speaker in America right now. It's certainly one that's influenced me a lot. So I was wondering how your literary taste developed, and could you talk about a bit about your relationship with Otto von Habsburg? What did you two talk about?
Well, all right. Those are two fairly different things, but we'll pull them all together. Uh, all right. Well, let me see. My literary taste. First, say thank you for that glowing compliment. I'm sorry to say that it's literally true. Our country's in bad shape right now. But at any rate, I'll accept it. I'll accept the compliment gratefully, as any writer will. Uh, well, let me see. How did my literary taste develop? Well, I suppose you really have to go back to my parents and my father in particular. Um, they were both great readers, and my dad had a very big library when I was a kid. Um, his interests ran to literature and history, as oddly enough I do. Uh, the I had uh, I had a very, very difficult time reading. This is going to sound like I'm being funny going all the way back, but actually it's not, as you'll see. I had a very difficult time learning to read in the first grade. Very poor at it. And the problem with that was that my family, my father, my brother, and my mother, were American Heritage subscribers. I'm speaking now of the late lamented hardcover magazine, which is trying a comeback, in case you're interested. American Heritage. Fascinating magazine. You can see all the issues now online. Um, but my dad subscribed to it, and whenever it would come in, my brother and my parents would sit around the dinner table talking about it. Well, this was annoying because I hadn't read it, I couldn't read it, and I couldn't join in. And then, as now, I love to talk. So, somewhere between first and second grade, I started really teaching myself to read with the basics that I'd acquired in school the year before. I started on my dad's treasure trove of EC comics, which were these horrible things in the 50s, really gruesome things like Tales from the Crypt and things like that. And also the what were called the Silver Age of comics then, Superman and Batman and all that in the 60s. I started the summer reading comic books like that, and by the time I went to school, I could read the American Heritage. And I can tell you that, and then shortly after that, my dad acquired from a library that was throwing it out one of these old Noah Webster dictionaries. They're the big, big library dictionaries. And he taught me how to chase down the etymologies of words. And because it was almost like a mini encyclopedia, that thing. And I had many a fun time when I didn't know a word, chasing it down and learning about it, and seeing whether it came from French or Latin or whatever its roots were. So early on, I had an interest in and then the other thing I should mention is that my father was also an endless source of our French Canadian folk tales. So all those things kind of melded together. We read Classics Illustrated when I don't know if you've heard of those. They were a comic book. I love comics. They were a comic book from one of the major works of Western literature, and they were wonderful, beautifully illustrated, and they gave you the plot and some major points of each book. And later on, most of the things that I'd read in Classics Illustrated, I read as real books. I would say that probably the first author to really play to play a big role in my development was Washington Irving. Living out here in L.A., having come to New York, I was very nostalgic as a child. Still am, really. Just last month I was back in the Hudson Valley and very, very happy to be there. But at any rate, so Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Robert Louis Stevenson was a big one. I loved Kidnapped and Treasure Island and all that stuff. The Poe, as I mentioned, was big. And then as I got a bit older, I discovered some of the English writers, Arthur Ransom, some of the children's authors, Eleanor Cameron and Lucy Boston, her Green Nose series. Well, I read voraciously. And the things that I liked would usually have a more or less fantastic element if they weren't complete science fiction or horror or fantasy. But they had to have a firm root in history. Tolkien I discovered I have to say that I'll always be eternally grateful to Mr. Crido, my sixth grade teacher, for introducing us to C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. And in junior high, I discovered Tolkien and was just utterly enchanted. And shortly after that, I read Lewis's Space trilogy, which is, especially the last one, I think his strength had a big influence on me. And then later Charles Williams. So you see, we got the Inklings out of the way. Believe it or not, I didn't discover Lovecraft until I was a freshman in college. And I also read a lot of Arthur Machen at the same time. Algernon Blackwood, shall we say, the traditional horror writers. And then and mysteries, Agatha Christie and, the lady that wrote Captain, Marjorie Allen, Dorothy Sayers. I mean, again, I could go on and on at the risk of being very boring, but I think I hope anyway, you see the directions my interests ran out. And the thing about Lovecraft, the difference between Tolkien and Lovecraft, as writers, they're both very good at atmosphere. But where Lovecraft falls short is he's trying to deliver horror. Now, I've always been enchanted by the atmosphere that Lovecraft creates, but I've never been frightened by it. And the reason, I think, is that his concept of horror, of fear, was the idea of man in an uncaring, neutral to hostile universe. And to be honest with you, I've never bought that. I've never felt it, if you understand what I mean. Tolkien always rang much truer to me. And as I got older and began to think about such things, I realized it was because Tolkien was Lord of the Rings is really an analysis, in a sense, an illustration, rather, of the relationship between grace and free will. And when you look at it in that light, you realize that despite the fantastic trappings, which are all very well done, I don't want to sell them short, despite all that, it's really very, very much an illustration of grace and free will, is very much how they tend to work together in the real world. And for the reader, unconsciously, that is where the Lord of the Rings derives its strength. Because the world really does work that way. A benign God working through apparently disconnected occurrences in relationship to countless individual wills. On the one hand, all doing what they want to, and on the other, nevertheless, one way or the other, fulfilling his grand design, either for the good or for the ill. You see a great illustration of that, in which in Gollum's life being spared out of pity. And as a result, in the end, although it doesn't do him himself any good, he's able, through biting off Frodo's finger and jumping into Mount Doom, he is able to ensure that the quest, which was just about to fail, succeeded. And that, you see, is the way I think things really are in life. We all, God rides straight with crooked lines. We realize that on some level. And when we read Lord of the Rings, there it is. With Lovecraft, well, the universe really isn't like that. So, anyway, I'm trying to go on like that, but you did ask. As for the Archduke, well, we corresponded most of the time I was in high school until he died. We met a couple of times. Once when he was launching his son's political campaign in Vienna, and the second and last time at the beatification of his father in Rome in 2004. And mostly what we talked about were religion and politics. What we wrote about, I should say. He was a very devout Catholic, a great believer in providence and in the eventual victory of the good, no matter how long that victory may be delayed. And that, of course, is another theme Tolkien touches on, just parenthetically. A lot of what he had to say was really basic common sense about not losing your head in fantastic and difficult times, about always keeping your eye on the main goal, remembering that despite whatever happens, God is still in charge, no matter how difficult that may seem to believe at times. And coming from him, who was a man who had seen so much, some really utterly horrific things, it's easier when that comes from a man who has every reason to doubt that than when it comes from someone who's never had difficulty in his life, if you see what I mean. So, I really can't tell you that I received any new or shocking revelations from the Archduke, but that was the whole point, wasn't it? It was, what he did for me was to reinforce my beliefs and to reassure me that they were in fact true. Whatever the rest of the world might think or say or do. And I have to say that's what I got from my father as well. So I was very fortunate. I had a lot of very good mentors in my life, of whom my dad was the first, but far from the only one.
Yeah.
I hope that answers those questions.
Another question is, how have you felt about politics in America over the last 16 years? Are things getting better or worse? And you mentioned in an old post on your old website, you said that you were near the Pentagon on 9/11, which I thought was interesting. And I know that you also met Ronald Reagan.
Yes, I did indeed. Well, how have politics gone for the past 16 years? Well, bad to worse. But it's been bad to worse in an almost organic manner. In other words, it's like when you see someone who's 50 and someone who's 70. It's going to go a certain way. You see someone who's got the smoker's act, and he keeps smoking, and I say this as a pipe smoker for anyone who thinks I'm bagging on smoking. If you start out with a heavy smoker's act, there's a good chance that in 10 or 20 years you're going to get lung cancer. If you don't eat, you'll starve. If you keep smacking your head with a hammer, at some point you'll probably get a concussion. I mean, we've just been going down the same path. So it's not as though really we're doing anything revolutionary or different. And I'll tell you what I mean. A lot of people were shocked, and certainly I was annoyed when the Supreme Court thanks to one vote, the great Catholic Mr. Justice Kennedy, brought gay marriage. And people say, gee, how could this happen? How could this happen? Well, you know, some of the advocates of quote-unquote gay marriage had some very important points. And one of them was that quote-unquote straight people had already hollowed out the institution of marriage to such a degree that, you know, why not? What was the camel's head? It was divorce, of course. Then the idea of contraceptive sexuality, and the idea that marriage really was more of a contract of convenience. Well, you know, we kept whittling it down and whittling it down and whittling it down and whittling it down until the civil concept of marriage and the popular concept of marriage was 180 degrees from what marriage really is. Now, mind you, that's not a defense of gay marriage in my mind, but it is a, what's the word? It's an appropriate observation. We had already desecrated marriage. So now we add one more. I mean, you're probably too young to remember when no-fault divorce came in, but it was a horrendous thing. It used to be, and mind you, as far as the church was concerned, any divorce was wrong in civil law. But nevertheless, the countries that did have divorce, and there were quite a few who didn't when I was a kid, I can tell you, but those who did, it was very hard to get one. You had to prove basically adultery. And one side was the innocent party, the other was the guilty party. That's why when you've heard that phrase, no-fault divorce, you see where that comes from. So the minute we said that marriage was something that could just be dissolved by the will of the couple, that it was no more than that, we were already, when we coupled that with the idea that contraceptive sex is good and okay, we were already on our way to marriage.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of what you said in your book, where you said, I mean, the Supreme Court justice was able to do what even Henry VIII couldn't do.
That's correct. I mean, you hear people talking about the horrors of absolute monarchy. We live in an absolute republic, and it doesn't bother anyone. And the thing is that all Mr. Justice Kennedy did was what, in this area, which was particularly glaring, is what the Supreme Court had been doing since the 60s. And that is shaping reality. Roe v. Wade, they could rule that the unborn child is not a human being. Well, okay. Well, what if the Supreme Court ruled that iron filings are nutritious? I guess that's true. What if the Supreme Court rules that green is not yellow? All right, well, you know, my joke at the time of 9/11 was that rather than pursuing Al-Qaeda, we should just have the Supreme Court slap an injunction on them. Wouldn't that do the trick? I mean, they'd cease to exist by virtue of their supremacies changing reality with their minds. So when you ask me about the course of politics over the past 16 years, the common response, at least for people of our sort, the common response would be, "Oh, it's just you know, terrible. It's really gotten bad." Well, yeah, but it's gotten bad the way you would expect it to get bad. Well, let me frame the question another way. Why wouldn't it have gone this way? Why would we not be going, once we're on this path, why would we not continue to follow? So I met Reagan. You know, the funny thing is people ask me about Reagan. I met him 3 times, briefly, each time. So it's not like he was a pal or anything. Though he did remember my name the second 2 times, the last 2 times, which tells you more about his impressive memory for faces and names than it does about me. But I tell people, well, he was the greatest president I lived under. That sounds impressive until you look at the other presidents I lived under. And then it's just like calling him the tallest pygmy. Well, great, lucky you. I was born in Eisenhower's reign. Eisenhower, who betrayed our allies Suez and sold out the Hungarians, both in 1956. I was elected. I was born the day Kennedy was elected. JFK, that great model of Catholic manhood in both public and private life. LBJ, the king of blackmail. Richard Nixon, who, was far from the utterly evil man he's been painted, but he was something of a bumbler. And he, of course, began the selling out of nationalist China, which is something I've always felt very strongly about. Gerald Ford, who was a nice person, I suppose, but not the brightest bulb in the tree. Jimmy Carter, who made brain dead a fashion accessory. Then comes Reagan. Then we have Bush Sr., who, as he used to say, suffered from the vision thing, meaning he didn't have any. Billy Clinton, who, gosh, America's best loved perjurer. Bush Jr., who had his own issues, never saw a bomb he didn't want to drop, and Obama. So when I tell you Reagan is the greatest president I lived under, that may or may not be a compliment. I mean, he didn't drool. He wasn't a raving moron. And don't get me wrong. I mean, I got to tell you, he did have some definite strengths. After the long night of Carter's 4 years, when he showed up at his inauguration in morning coat, striped trousers, gosh, radiating confidence. It's morning in America. Oh, man, that felt great, let me tell you. That just absolutely felt great. But 8 years, and then it vanished. Poof, oh, God, no more, bye-bye. So, anyway, at the risk of rambling even further, I'll just tell you that the course of the politics in the 16 years that we've seen has been, on the one hand, utterly abysmal, but on the other hand, totally natural, given what our principles are. I mean, if I'm totally dedicated to spending more than I actually bring in, I mustn't be surprised if I'm poor. If I dedicate myself to eating every scrap of food I can stuff in my mouth, I shouldn't be surprised if I'm fat. It's just, you do what you do, and then you reap the reward. So where we are now is the result of who we have been. And, if we don't like how it looks, well, that's tough. Now, Mr. Trump came to power out of wave of resentment built up by the elites changing things so quickly. But it's basically reactive. I doubt highly that either he or his constituents want to address any of the real problems the country has.
Yeah, the guy who's been married 3 times will really fix no-fault divorce.
Yeah, I mean that'll happen. He's really going to tell the people of the United States that the demographic implosion is their fault. And if they really want to save Social Security, they should start breeding. So, who's going to say that? Who's going to say that? Who would want to hear that? So, I do appreciate the resentment that brought him to power. And certainly, as far as it goes, it's certainly understandable. But in terms of it solving anything, that's a whole different story. I may be mad as hell the people the people are coming in and taking my stuff. But if you tell me, okay, that's nice, you're going to have to buy a lock. What, spend money? Well, okay. Don't buy a lock then. It's nice that I see there's a problem, but if I'm not willing to do anything about it, I shouldn't complain. So, there you are for that one. What else you got?
I like what you said in your latest book, Star Spangled Crown, um, which is a great book, and
Thank
you
you.
had this one part where you turned around the question, when did you become a monarchist, to when did you stop being a monarchist? Because in cultures all over, boys dream of being kings and girls dream of being princesses. I mean, Netflix even has that new show, The Crown. Uh, and
Yep.
you also mentioned, um, so I thought that was nice. Another thing you mentioned in the book that I don't know that I had ever heard from you before is that you knew the king of Rwanda. Um,
I sure did. Yeah, he just died last month, God rest him. Yep, I sure did. He was a very interesting story there. Rwanda and its sort of mirror image country, Burundi, were their monarchies went back to roughly the same time as William the Conqueror. And what had happened in both cases was that these people, the Tutsi, had come from the north and conquered the locals, the Hutu. And the Tutsi were these very tall, and when I say tall, I'm talking like 7 foot, even 8 foot. They're tall people. And they were cattle herders. And so they swept into this area, and the people who were living there already were, well, were the pygmies who had already been there. But they had been in turn conquered by the Hutu, who were a typical Bantu people of East Africa. They're no, in other words, the normal size. The Hutsi, the Tutsi, the also Watusi, have somewhat European features. I mean, they're black, but they've got, like Ethiopians a bit. Uh, Whereas the Hutu, as I say, are regular Bantu. So they conquered the Bantu, and from that day until the 1960s, ruled them. But the royal family of, I don't know about Burundi, but Rwanda, the royal family was pretty quickly, uh, shall we say, interbred. The idea being that the king ceased to be either Hutu or Tutsi, but was the king. And what was interesting about that, the king's secretary was also a member of the royal, not the royal family, but one of the nobles hereditarily close to the royal family. He had the facial features to the secretary of a Tutsi, but the height of a Hutu. He was a normal height. The king, on the other hand, had somewhat Bantuish features, but had the height of a Tutsi. He was 7'2". He was huge. Um, well, in the course of time, first the Germans and then the Belgians became the protectors of these two countries, and the White Fathers went to work converting them to Catholicism. In Rwanda, they were very successful, so much so that the king's brother, who became king before him, Mutara III, consecrated Rwanda to Christ the King back in the 50s. But the year after independence was given to the Congo, Mutara died mysteriously after a visit to a Belgian doctor. And Kigeli, who was a very, very young man, he was, I think, a late teenager at that time, became king. Well, the Belgians began favoring those who wanted to overthrow the monarchy. And because they were still running the show, they were in a position to help them. And they did. The king was in Leopoldville consulting with the UN and Belgian authorities. And while he was out of the country, there was a coup, and the monarchy was overthrown. And he attempted on a number of occasions to get back in the country by disguise and various other things. It was found out every time. So In 92, he was living, you might say, around the borders of Rwanda in Africa. And then in 92, he got word of the impending genocide. So he decided to come to the United States to try to get the Congress of the United States to do something about it. He failed. But he was in the States ever after. And he spent his time trying to raise money for Rwandese orphans and refugees and people like that. And on several occasions, I had the honor of playing ADC to him in different cities, Vancouver and Los Angeles and Washington and elsewhere. Very pious guy, very devout, very honorable man, real gentleman, no money. And of course, I used to joke with him that if only he'd been a president instead of a king, we'd all be better off. And he said, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "Well, if you'd been president of Rwanda, you'd have already had 4/5 of the country's treasury out of the country squirreled away in bank accounts. And so when you were overthrown, it'd be great. You know, we'd all be on easy street. Instead, it was this whole, oh, my people are my treasure thing. And look what you've got to show for it." He laughed pretty hard, actually. But that was King Kigeli of Rwanda, God rest him.
Can you talk about I wasn't planning on asking this question, but I just thought that I should. How did you? I mean, you've done all sorts of things in your life, but how did you end up becoming a stand-up comedian at one point?
Well, there's a kind of a simple answer to that. I finished college at Cal State Northridge, and I was kind of at loose ends. I didn't know what I was going to do with myself. Um, I had worked in Washington, decided that politics was not for me. I went to a military college and all that for a 2-year school, NMI, which I'm inordinately proud of. But I decided the military, in its then incarnation as uniformed managers of violence, as they said then, was not something I wanted. So frankly, I didn't know what to do with myself. I tried several strange jobs. I was a house detective at the Century Plaza Hotel, an at-need salesman for Forest Lawn for a short time, things like that. Managed the office of a hardware store. But none of it, so what? None of it clicked. And then some friends of mine heard about an open mic night at the late lamented Geo's on Sunset Boulevard. And I went. And I told jokes, and people laughed, and they asked me to come back. And they did this several times until they started paying me to come back. And then I started playing other clubs, and after about a year, I was making some relatively decent money out of it. And so I can honestly tell you that, like everything else good that's ever been in my life, I fell into it.
Well, to end on a lighter note, even since you've been a film critic in the past, what are some of your favorite movies and TV shows?
Well, all right. That's a very good question and a very enjoyable one. So let's start with movies, shall we? I would say probably my favorite movie of all time, if I had to choose, and it's hard because a lot of them are. But my single favorite movie of all time would be They Might Be Giants, with George C. Scott, about a judge who goes crazy and thinks he's Sherlock Holmes. Beyond that, gosh, so many taps. The story of a military high school that takes on a life of its own. The original Christmas Carol, 1938, Original Dawn. Oh, I could go on and on and on. Gee willikers, there's so many of them. Boy, I'm just sitting here, and there's so many films hitting my head, I can't say any of them. On Borrowed Time with Lionel Barrymore, Dinner at 8, Grand Hotel, Uh, so many of them. But my tastes run. I mean, if you were to ask me about shows I've seen recently that I liked, my tastes run to the fantastic and somewhat the science fiction. But I prefer a film with a moral center, with a real moral frame of reference. Um, and the problem with a lot of things today is that they simply don't have it. Vampires aren't driven off by crosses, and virtue is, if anything, a hindrance. I mean, take, for example, a show that I don't recommend you watch without being able to fast forward quickly, and that's Game of Thrones. Quite apart the egregious flesh, which we'll just take as read and leave alone. Apart from that, it's a universe where virtue doesn't matter. It's well acted, well scripted, compelling, but at the end of the day, meaningless. Similarly, so far with the Walking Dead series, Westworld, all very, very well accomplished, very well executed. But at the end of the day, what are they telling us? Actually, as I'm talking, Westworld has more of a moral center than the rest of them do, although it's hard to see. And then, of course, as I say, there's the overwhelming amounts of flesh. I mean, which contributes to cheapening public taste on top of everything else. You know, there's kind of a connection here, frankly, and this will going to sound a little strange, but I don't really care. I'm a little strange, I suppose. There is a connection, you might say, between nudity in film and foul language in comedy. If you need it, you're not really that great. You're just not. I mean, it's the shortcut to attention. When you look back at the history of film, you think of the Hays Code. I'm going to point something out funny. If you haven't heard of the Hays Code, it was basically what kept from the late 20s, early 30s until the 60s. It was what, kept us from having all the egregious nudity and foul language in film. And it's a big deal today to decry the censorship and blah, 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 blah. Well, notice also, though, that many, if not all, of our cleverest films were made during that period. Why? Because you had to be clever. To get your point across without being obvious, you had to be clever. Where now you've got someone being tossed on the bed by an assailant. In days gone by, you had to illustrate what was going to happen with a look, an expression, a word. That took ingenuity. It took creativity. And I'm enough of a fuddy-duddy to say it produced a better genre of film, in my humble opinion. Now, having said all of that, there is one other filmmaker I would be remiss if I didn't address. And that, of course, was the late, great Edward D. Wood, Jr., who brought us such classics as Leonard Glendale, my personal favorite, Plan 9 from Outer Space. He's been hailed as the worst film director, producer, and writer who ever lived, and it's probably deserved. But he's also one of the few I can say I knew. And the funny thing about an Ed Wood film, most bad movies are just bad movies. You know, you watch them, and that's 2 hours of your life, and never get back again. But the thing with Ed's films is that they were bad. They were dreadful in every way that makes sense. They were terrible films. But it's as though they were coming from an alternate universe with a very different frame of reference. Because Unlike most bad films, which you see once and hope you can wash your brain out, you can watch his stuff over and over again and always find something new, even as though it were a good picture. They have a kind of demented what's the word? A demented context to them. I think probably my favorite line of all time from Plan 9 from Outer Space was when the hero is about to go fly his airplane, and his wife says, he says to his wife, they're living by the cemetery where all these strange things have happened, "I'd still feel better if you'd stay with your mother." And she says, "Oh, most men get upset when their wives go home to mama." And he says, "That's not the point." And her response, classic, "That's all the point there's going to be." It's true of the film, it's true of a lot of life. That's all the point there's going to be. So if you haven't seen Plan 9 from Outer Space, I do heartily recommend it. I see there might be giants for inspiration and all that kind of thing. See Plan 9 from Outer Space to put your brain on hold for a while. Which is a practice I have to recommend, particularly today. Well, do you have any more questions
I
to
think
throw at
that's
me?
all. Thank you for doing this, Charles.
Ah, my pleasure entirely. You do get the point where it's almost a pleasure to explain your whys and wherefores. Um, the one question you didn't ask, but it's one that I haven't asked before, is why I became a monarchist.
Yes, I didn't want to. I did that intentionally because I didn't want to spoil your section in your book. But I mean, if you want to talk about that, do you want to talk about that?
Ah, well, I could. The easy answer is go see the book, but the truth of the matter is that my political, my religious, and my literary views, etc., the origins are all wrapped up together. That's the best way I can put it. That's the best way I can put it. You see, one of the things that we, in our culture, are used to doing, in this American culture around us, is separating things from each other. Our religion from our politics, from art, from life. All my work has been an attempt to break down that division, because it's one I've always seen as alien, and I've never really felt it myself. Again, I was fortunate with the father I had, because that division of which I speak is very peculiar to Protestant cultures in general, and to this one really in particular, because we ran much further with it than the English or the Danes or the Swedes or anybody. Religion, politics, art, and life, they're really all part and parcel of a greater whole. And we have completely forgotten that.
And in your book, you kind of synthesize that. That's something like your book. This latest book is like it's just a perfect synthesis of your thoughts, at least so far. I thought.
Well, yeah, I really it was a fun book to write, and you're right. I mean, if of everything I've ever written, it probably comes the closest to being a personal credo. And the problem I had, of course, is that if you're going to write something like that, either you're someone whom the world considers important, in which case people will want to read it, or you've got to put it out in such a way that it's readable. Who would buy a book, what I hold and why I hold it? Who would read something like that? But just as you see Tolkien's worldview in Lord of the Rings, You do see mine in Star Spangled Crown. Um, and one thing I'm very, very happy about is that the reviewers, and it's got a goodly number of reviews now on Amazon and elsewhere. The reviewers so far all seem to get what I was trying to do. And for that, I am very, very, very grateful.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Again, thank you, Charles.
You're most welcome.